All right, we are right at the top of the hour. Thank you everybody for joining today's webinar, Information Governance, Lessons Learned from 2021. We appreciate you joining us here today. And the first thing I'd like to do is just take a second and introduce who your speakers are. My name is Shana Horka, and I work in product marketing here at Gimel, and I will be the host of today's webinar. And I am joined by our key speaker, Gimel's Vice Chairman, David Quackenbush.
Hi, everybody.
Now, before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, and we're going to answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will also be at least one poll question that you'll see pop up in a separate screen, so please keep an eye out for that, and all answers are anonymous, so we appreciate your participation. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. Now, to kick things off, I have a couple of slides here to tell you a little bit about Gimel and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of solutions. Gimel is an information governance software company that was founded in 2002. Our main mission is to help you achieve your information governance goals by providing solutions that help you balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you're trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, or migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimel can help you achieve your information governance goals. We have a client success team and a global network of partners that deliver solution in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. On the screen, you can see Gimel's family of software products. They work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solutions include migration from legacy systems, file analysis and e-discovery, electronic and physical records management, and document management for SAP content. But with that, I'm going to actually go ahead and hand it off to David so he can get started with today's presentation.
Thanks, Shana. Appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. Hard to believe that we're nearing the end of February already. And at the same time, over the past 2 years, it's been kind of a strange existence for many of us with all the different forms of lockdown and the like. And I'm reminded that I think we're on the other side as the rodeo in Houston is about to begin starting this weekend. And this will be the first time that we've gotten together in a big group like this in quite a while. So everyone is chomping at the bit, so to speak, to get out there and get in the crowd for the next 3 weeks. So interesting times to say the least. It was kind of funny when we thought about this topic. Shana came to me and said, "Hey, we're thinking about doing something around, taking a look back and what we've all kind of been through the last couple of years, and what have been the impacts on things that are near and dear to our heart, like information governance." And so that really is the genesis of this presentation and webinar today. Hopefully what you'll get out of it is some interesting bits of information that you might be able to take back to your company and think about how now the landscape of information governance has shifted once again, and perhaps in a way that may be profound enough to affect real change in the organization going forward, given what we've all been through in the last 2 years. So we'll cover those topics in terms of what's changed and what is changing. We'll look a little bit at all the things that have gone on in that period of time, including work from home and hybrid models, edge computing, automation, all those kinds of events and activities and innovations that have occurred over this period of time, and what impact that's having, and then suggest some action plans for the new normal, whatever we think that is. So let's dig in and happy to answer questions at the end. We'll try to save some time for that as well. So what has changed? And, what has changed is always kind of interesting, because I think a lot of us that are in this business or have this type of profession think of change as a constant anyway. So you think, well, what has changed? Well, what hasn't changed to me? Because we're always dealing with change. But if you think about what's happened in the last couple of years, profound changes have really started to occur in terms of the way we individuals think about work and working, and really probably more so than any time in, well, I know in my career. So I'll suspect, given my age, that that applies to almost everybody on this call, that in our careers, really, we haven't seen the kind of change in thinking about how we work and how we are working than we have over the last couple of years. And so, how we work, things like being more connected yet disconnected at the same time. So, which is sort of interesting. And oddly enough, we were talking about this earlier today with some former colleagues, and it was kind of interesting. The thought is, what was assumed hard because it was technology based, really was quite easy for most organizations to adapt to when we had to go to work from home. And the things that we take for granted, such as going to the file room to get a physical file, or getting our mail or something like that, all of a sudden became hard because we weren't in the place that we all showed up to, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or something like that. So a very interesting conundrum there in terms of how everyone had to adapt to the idea that working from home was quite different, but yet we still had to figure out how to do it and do it in a way that was effective and productive. Where we work from a hybrid perspective, and as we came on the other side of the lockdowns and people were starting to kind of work their way back into the office in drips and drabs, is, how does this hybrid thing work? And it's kind of funny when you think about the old established companies are probably the most challenged with change because they're used to doing things a certain way, and the newer nimble companies have been doing remote work and hybrid work, or even no office whatsoever for the beginning of their company. That's just how they decided they were going to work and how they were going to do things. So the change that was really required to the existing brick and mortar businesses of this hybrid concept, and how do we work that into our way of doing things going forward, and how do we think about productivity, and what impacts on productivity did work from home have, and were they positive impacts or negative impacts? Did it teach us anything about how we measure productivity in a way that was going to be useful in the new world order, and things like that? And then just sort of interesting new, more as, if you will, around communication. And, we were all in this mode of using Teams or Zoom or something like that. Do you have your cameras on, or do you have your cameras off? And if you have your camera off, what does that say? Some companies, including ours, we said, okay, well, if you're not going to be in the office and you're going to be online working and doing Teams meetings and things like that, you need to have your camera on. And that's just should be part of the standard operating procedure. And some organizations didn't think that way, or didn't require that. And even others were not prepared for it because they maybe were working from desktops that didn't have camera setups, or maybe their laptops didn't have cameras on them, or what have you. So some very interesting things that change was happening. And then last but not least, how we manage information. And, you know, now all of a sudden, there's yet again more places for content because instead of having an office with people in it every day, now there's people scattered at 10,000 different locations throughout the day, and how information comes in and gets used and gets stored and gets sent to the next person. Everyone had to think about that in some cases because a lot of it was still physical. Like I said, how are we going to get physical information to the house? If I wanted to check out a box, because that's what I mostly had still were physical files. How do I do that? Does Iron Mountain come to my house? I mean, or what's that like? And just the mail that I might get on a daily basis in the office, correspondence and things like that. And in some industries, such as oil and gas, you know, they get a ton of correspondence in from their royalty owners and interest owners in hard mail. So how, if they hadn't already begun digitizing all that information as it was hitting the mailroom, how is that going to be dealt with? So a lot of interesting challenges there in terms of thinking about how to manage information coming out of this, really from cradle to grave. And not to mention, in the middle of all this, if security wasn't a challenge already, it became a more pronounced issue for many organizations, which is, and privacy as well, which is, again, how do I do a better job of controlling, securing, making private information private, and so on. And how does doing that from 10,000 locations differ from having 10? So what hasn't changed? And so I think it's always useful to balance the equation when you start talking about things like this and the changes and the profound impacts that they've had on us. You know, at the end of the day, we still need to find important information to get work done. Nothing's really changed about that. And what we learned, many of us learned, physical information and records are still important. And I think, you know, for many years, I think everyone was starting to think that, hey, you know, with all the advances in technology and electronic document management systems and records management platforms and things like that, that physical records and their like would start to go by the wayside. But what we saw anyway was a re-emphasis on physical and making sure that their physical systems were in really good shape, not only because they were going through digitization efforts, which was part of that, but also because they needed to figure out ways of being able to track all this physical information, because it might be being used in lots of different places that it wasn't being used before. Communication is better the closer we are to each other, and that's kind of an obvious point. But I think it was made clear that during the separation and now this hybrid work style, that people are people, and you know, it works for some things. We can have these conversations over Teams or Zoom, but you still have to find ways of getting together, everyone together from time to time at least, because that's just how we human beings are. And managing information to make it easy on me still hasn't changed either. But now you've got an added challenge, which is when I'm not in the office, and making it easier on me means I need to have it close to me. Does that mean now I've got, you know, records in my house or documents in my house that aren't connected to my corporate laptop because I'm using my home workstation, and I don't use the systems of the company to store my documents. I always store my documents on my C drive. So now I was using my home computer, and so now a lot of my work's on my C drive instead of in the corporate repository, whatever it is. So a lot of interesting things there from a what has changed, what hasn't changed perspective. So what's changing now as a result of all this? And I think this is the good stuff. You know, I think that because of what's happened, technology is starting to take an even greater role in our new thinking about when you think, and particularly when you think about information governance in terms of automation, in terms of cloud-based environments versus on-premise based environments, leveraging AI and machine learning and things like that to improve automation and ultimately productivity of people's jobs by doing a lot of the rote work through automation and being able to allow the worker bees out there to focus on the problem solving and the critical parts of their job, not figuring out how to find a document or something like that, or figuring out how to classify a document 10 different ways so that someone else can find it. What's been an interesting phenomenon, or at least or reported as such, I'm not sure that this is actually as critical as everyone thinks it has been, this great concept of the Great Resignation. As I read into it, it's more pent-up demand for people moving around from place to place, and that just didn't happen for close to 2 years. So now that the opportunity is right for people to improve their career path, they're just doing it in greater quantities now because they weren't doing it much at all for the last 2 years. But with that, regardless of the reason for it, with that come other issues the corporation has to start dealing with, in terms of digital access management and loss prevention and orphan content and records, and issues like that become even more prevalent than they were before, because all of a sudden I might have a significant group of people walking out the door on a regular basis right now, and I've got people coming in just as fast. So I need to really have better understanding of how I'm going to deal with all this kind of things, issues from a content management and information management perspective. ESG obviously is added to that as well during this period of the last couple of years. And so there's more regulation, there's more compliance, there's more requirement on transparency. All these things are going to be hugely effective or ineffective based on an organization's ability to have a good information governance program in place, because you're really talking about as people are looking for information related to various ESG matters, how well an organization is able to respond to scenarios around ESG matters is going to become more and more critical. And again, I think those kinds of issues are becoming pretty well understood just by watching the news in a lot of days. Increased control. So now we've got this issue where we've got more people not coming into the office on a regular basis. I've got to figure out a way, the organization has to figure out a way of having more control and more security requirements, as well as being able to address privacy concerns while still managing information in a way that people can find what they need to get their job done quickly. So figuring out that increased control dynamic and how I can apply it in a way that doesn't interfere with productivity. And last but not least, the digitalization push has been accelerated because, again, people started to realize that even if they didn't have a lot of physical information, what little they might have had was still used quite frequently and was inaccessible, or maybe not very easily accessible during this period of time. So really thinking more about digitalizing physical information more rapidly to support the new work environment. So we have a quick poll here. We've talked about physical a few times, and I bring it up only because it was very interesting. thing when we saw that more emphasis was being placed on physical over the last few years than we had seen in a long time. And so I was just curious, as we were putting this presentation together, what everybody else thought about that from the audience perspective. And that is, how did you handle physical information during the lockdown? Was it something that was thought out on the fly because it happened so quickly? Did it work well? So just curious from y'all's perspective, how you did it, and give you a couple minutes to answer and get a sense of what the group came up with there. And while we've already got some poll results. So it looks like right now the overwhelming majority of people had a drop off at the office. That was the utilization method for dealing with physical. That's the one, and that makes sense. I mean, that's what we had heard most often. We have had a few that kind of fell in these other categories. Many were really trying to figure out, how is this going to work long term? If there was going to be a prolonged lockdown, how was it going to work long term if I had to start delivering physical, which I don't think very many places really got to that point in their life cycle before things started to open back up enough where people could get into the office, at least temporarily, to get some of this stuff. All right. Moving right along, so we're doing okay on time. So what does the new normal look like? New normal is obviously there's going to be a lot more work from home. In fact, I read a statistic, heard a statistic the other day that pre-pandemic, there were 6% of the working population was able to work from home as a typical part of their day-to-day life. That number grew to 30%. During the lockdown period and beyond. And so it's still probably not at that level right now, but still pretty high. And I think what we're seeing is that most of the people that we come into contact with, organizations that we come into contact with, are implementing new hybrid policies where you'll work 3 to 4 days a week in the office with validation of vaccination and so forth, and 1 to 2 days from your house. So really changing the way people think about how people work and where people work, and ultimately I suspect it'll obviously have an impact on commercial real estate and how people think about office space and those kinds of things as well going forward. Things like edge computing and Internet of Things and other opportunities to really continue to extend the digital transformation all the way out to the corners of the organization are obviously now front and center and a significant part of the conversation for organizations that have that, because all of a sudden, for a while at least, they went from hardly any people being outside of an office to almost all their people being outside of the office. So really stretching the edge of the corporate network in that regard. And, how in that regard, we're going to really be able to manage information consistently with all the challenges that brings. And then automation, including artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies, and how that's going to continue to be influencing and embedding itself into the everyday work streams of a lot of the things that we're doing from an information governance perspective. You think about capabilities like Syntex from Microsoft and the Microsoft 365 stack and things like that, really trying to, again, automate as much of the mundane elements of information governance as possible so that it can be done more consistently. So what does everybody need, going forward in this new normal? I think it's pretty clear that well-organized, high-quality data is an imperative if you can't be next to each other all the time and doing a lot of the things that you do in an office that make information sharing easier, even when there's challenges with the data. When you're separated, you quickly realize that a better data set and well organized makes productivity much better. And so that's going to be clearly another thing that's going to be on everybody's mind going forward. And then, of course, really being able to, from a security and access management perspective, verifying who you are. When I'm in the office, that's pretty easy to do. When I'm on the corporate network, that's pretty easy to do. When I'm floating around with my laptop and I may not even be on a VPN, continuing to figure out information security protocol and things like that are going to continue to be front of mind, I'm pretty certain, for a while. And then, the things that need to be removed, so it's really, again, I think all this brought to the forefront the idea that cleaning up the data set is pretty high importance, getting rid of the rot, getting rid of the expired content. Whether you're archiving it or deleting it, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's getting it out of the mainstream of the environment, dealing with superfluous content, things that are really, they may not be considered expired, but they're just notes. And so maybe you need to have a different way of managing that kind of information than having it in the mainstream of your governed repositories for content. And so postcards from the edge, thought it was kind of a funny little way to think about this, but some fairly clear statements now. As information gets further away from the source, the harder it is to manage. And I think a lot of organizations found this out very quickly. And at the same time, there was sort of this odd, thing that happened, that getting people connected through things like Teams and Zoom happened probably a lot more quickly than anybody would have imagined under normal circumstances. So, so while that became easier, all of a sudden managing all this information, connecting us was easy, managing all of our information got harder as we got further away from the source. I think COVID made the assumed obvious, which is best practices for organizations is to manage information consistently wherever it lives, because you can't control where it lives anymore. So you've got to figure out a way to have a program in place that improves that consistency in its various locations. And automation helps, but like a lot of things, if I haven't really established a good foundation of measurable information governance policies, then it's really not going to help that much, because automation, good quality automation, depends on good quality data and consistent data. So you have to still establish that foundation of information governance in order to make these new capabilities more effective. And a couple of final points here on what the new world looks like. We kind of talked about this already, but process change that we've all been experiencing and will continue to experience in 22 requires good data. That having good data is really the foundation for a lot of things, and information governance being sort of at the heart of that is an imperative for continuing to adapt to the new work styles that are being required and demanded in the marketplace today. Cleaning up the data, getting rid of the data cholesterol, data minimization. I think forever and a day, you talk about collecting information in cheap disk and all this blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, less is still more. And being able to clean up and remediate the data sets is critical success factor. But the challenge for most organizations is establishing an attainable plan. because it's also very overwhelming now. Most of the people we come into contact with and organizations we come into contact with that have significant volumes, hundreds of terabytes and petabytes of information, and the idea that that can be cleaned up easily with or without good tools is a significant challenge. And you think about it today, greater than 60% of the content in most of our organizations is rot. And so it's really about, again, establishing the policy and then building the attainable plan for remediating that rot. And last but not least here, really, obviously data security, privacy, and disposition become critical success factors as part of an information governance program, and disposition being last but not least, something that more and more people are doing, but still probably not enough really using disposition in a life cycle effectively. And again, it doesn't have to mean deleting when you're disposing of something, as most of y'all know. Data retention versus record retention. So this is an interesting point as it relates to, in order to manage your records, you have to sort of understand all your data so that you know what your records really are. And so really retention applies to everything. And then there's a subset of retention that is very specific to records requirements. So you really have to have both. And there's no reason why your retention strategy doesn't include work in process and other non-records, because keeping the hygiene up as you move forward is going to always be needed. You can't just do this once. It needs to be a constant process. And then, again, the way you do this is really through attainable bursts of activity, leveraging some technology, but doing it over a sustainable period of time. And people that we've talked to, organizations that we've talked to that have been successful at doing large-scale cleanups have done it over, it's a multi-year project, because it's still an overwhelming task. And even with the tools that are hugely helpful, it's still an overwhelming task. So you just can't dump it on a group of people and assume it's going to get done in a few months or within a year. It's a very long haul, but something that needs to be done. So I thought in here that I put in a couple of interesting quotes that have always been fun for me to remember. One I picked up when I was in college from John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist. Actually, I think he came up with this during the Great Depression, which is in talking about macroeconomic policy. In the long run, we're all dead. So really meaning there is no long run that you can plan for. I mean, everything is really going to happen in the current. So you need to figure out your plans to deal with things appropriately as you're going through the days and weeks and months in front of you to solve this problem. And from one of my favorite movies, The Patriot, aim small, miss small. So again, I think the challenge we all run into is these information governance programs are big, they're complex, they're overwhelming, but taking it bite by bite, as some would say, you eat the elephant one bite at a time, not the whole thing, are all kind of clear points of focus for moving forward. So with that, I'm not sure I left much time for questions.
Yeah, I can actually go ahead and take it over from here. So just to be conscious of time, if anybody had a hard stop at the 30-minute mark, we are 4 minutes past. But, we're always happy to have David on our webinars because he provides a lot of great information on what's going on in information governance. We don't typically talk about our solutions in webinars like this, but we do have resources that kind of spiral off of a lot of topics that he mentioned here, because this was a lot of great information. Or if you'd like more information on our products, our solutions, just want resources, you should see a poll question pop up on your screen. Just go ahead and answer that yes, and we'll have somebody reach out and see what we can provide for you. Because I do want to be respectful of time, I will read just one Q&A question because I did promise Q&A, but then we will email all the other questions. We'll email you back to make sure you get your questions answered. So I'm going to move on to the next screen so you guys can see our email addresses there. You can email either one of us and then we'll get the correct answer to you. But the one question we want to leave with, David, is how have you seen companies clean up data while working from home? Does remote work affect this process?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I would say that establishing the policy, number one, is the first step in that, because you've got to figure out a way that says you can't, working from home is not an excuse to store your own personal information on your own personal hard disk. You know, you've got to make sure that all information has got to be stored in the corporate repositories. And that includes, if you're creating physical items, how you've got an automatic policy for getting those back to wherever you're storing them. The cleanup part is actually a little bit different. And so I suspect that you could actually pull that off by working from home, given the right tooling, because again, you need to be doing these in kind of attainable chunks where you run a scan. Say you might run a scan of your own user drive and get the analysis on it, and then say, well, you've got X amount of time to get rid of X, Y, and Z because we no longer allow X, Y, and Z on the corporate file share, for instance, or something like that. And you start to winnow down all the easy low-hanging fruit. And I think the easy low-hanging fruit can easily be handled that way from still in a work from home environment. I think as you get closer to the more complex issues associated with data cleanup, obviously that requires a little bit more interaction, I think, with a variety of stakeholders that might make it easier if you're all in one room dealing with it.
Great. Well, if anyone can think of any more questions, if you submitted questions, we'll make sure to get back to you. We both have kind of hard names to spell. So if you want to make it easier on yourself, you can always email info@gimmel.com or visit our website, www.gimmel.com. For those looking for a recording of this webinar, a lot of great information to bring back to your team. We will be sending it out in the form of thank you email between 24 and 48 hours. Please keep an eye out for that. But thank you, David. We really appreciate it. A lot of people in the chat really appreciate it. And we hope to see everybody on our webinar next week titled Managing Chaos in File Shares. We hope you have a great day and thank you for joining.
Thanks, everybody.